virtue of our exposing ourselves to unusually
Alright,
high
good
amounts
evening
of
Earth. This is Adam
mutagens
Sturch
in
broadcasting
foods
from the Mushroom
as we
Mansion, Taos,
expanded
New
our
Mexico,
diet, and
working on
drugs and
oil
foods come
painting
in here.
in the
The other
details.
part of the
Alright,
equation, which is
this
much
evening
more
what I want to do
speculative and
is
which
put
we'll talk
in
about
the
tomorrow
moon,
night,
which is very lightly penciled in right about there,
has to do
with
the
some gray.
notion
And I'm going to take
of an
a
attractor
very thin
and
set of
trying
glazes,
to look
a medium blue
humanness
and sort of a
not
reddish
as
peach,
a
and start
mistake,
going
a
in
cosmic
between
error,
all of the
or as
ripples
Heidegger
and
said,
deepening
of man. He said we are flung into being, the idea always
them
being that it doesn't make
into
sense,
more
that there's
watery,
an arbitrariness
into a more watery
to
texture.
us.
Okay,
But
so here we go.
I think that there's a way of analyzing a process that will show that we are not only part of what is going on, an embedded part of what is going on, but that we actually represent the place where all the eggs are poured into one basket. And I'll just say a little bit about this tonight. When you look at the history of the universe, if you look with unbiased eyes, I think that what you will see is that the universe is a novelty-producing and conserving system of some sort. The early universe was so simple that when we now we're going with science here for a minute, we're asked to believe that it sprang from nothingness in a single moment, that its diameter was less than that of an electron. And then in a very short period of time, a number of very dramatic things happened, but they are all couched in terms of an expansion and cooling. From the moment the universe is born, it begins to cool. And as it cools, complexity magically crystallizes out. The original universe, there weren't even atoms, because there was such high temperatures that atoms could not stabilize themselves into orbits around atomic nuclei. So there was what's called a plasma, just a soup of naked electrons. And then gradually, as the universe cooled, the simplest of all atomic systems was able to form, the hydrogen atom. And these hydrogen atoms were produced in staggering amounts, and they began to clump together. And this is tricky, but not our problem. This is a problem for science. They don't know why they clumped, because it should have all been smooth, right down to today, but it isn't. So in this clumping process, of course, great temperatures and pressures were created at the centers of these masses of hydrogen, and a novel process, therefore, could spring into existence, the process of fusion. And fusion of hydrogen in early stars cooked out heavier elements, iron, sulfur, and especially carbon. Well, after that, then you get all those molecular or atomic species, and then they can aggregate into molecular species. And then, because of the presence of 4-valent carbon, very complex molecules called polymers, which are chain molecules, can form. Some of them acquire the quality of being able to replicate. Some of them acquire the ability to enclose themselves in a membrane, and so forth and so on. And in short, the march is on toward you and I here this evening. But what's interesting to note is that each successive stage in this process happens more rapidly than the process which preceded it. So that the early universe, 10 billion years goes on, and it's all about this star formation cookout thing. And then, planetary formation. And then once you get, and then 1 billion years, they wait for primitive prokaryotic life. And then, once it happens, the eukaryotes follow fast, and after them, the ciliated protozoas, and, it's just a moment to Madonna. Both of them. Okay, now, what science says about this process is that what we're seeing is an illusion, or that it doesn't matter. They're saying it is not a law of the universe that novelty be conserved, and that each new level of novelty proceed more quickly than the one which was its parent. And so by chopping it off like that, human history is denied any relevance in the natural order. It is not part of the natural order. And even though we think we're a secular society, our assumptions about history are straight out of Genesis. You know, we do not think of history as a branch of biology, and which it obviously is. So what I believe is happening is an accelerating process of novelty conservation that has reached such a point now, at the close of the second millennium, that it is absurd to try to propagate the human future by fantasy centuries into the future. There is no future, because the rate of acceleration is so close to approaching infinity that no possible future can be imagined. Now, people talk about this, but they never draw the implications. You've probably seen some show on television where they say, you know, here's the curve of human energy release, and here's the Stone Age, and here's the 16th century, and here's the 20th century, and it's headed for infinity. Okay, next slide. Here's the curve of human speed. In the 1750, people could go as fast as a horse could gallop. In 1820, the steam engine, and then the 20th, and then it goes to infinity. And they say, okay, here's the human population curve. In the year 1000, there were 400 million people on Earth. In the year 1850, and so forth, and it goes to infinity. So they don't believe it. They don't believe that the rational extrapolation of the trends visibly beheld in the present preclude the possibility of any imaginable future. Or at least I don't believe so. I believe that we're actually in the grip of a process that cannot be halted or accelerated, but which is now in a process of tightening its gyres, as William Butler Yeats said, that what we call the chaos of 20th century history is in fact the speeding up of this temporal process to the point where it is now visible within a single human lifetime. I mean, we're like mayflies or something, you know, we're born one day and we die the next. So only the most incredibly accelerated kinds of change make any impression upon us whatsoever. I mean, mostly we say nothing happens. But in fact, you know, in the 20th century, it's incredible. In the last 12 months, there has been more change compressed into time than in the previous 20 years. And those 20 years had more change in them than the previous 100 years. And that 100 years had more change in it than the previous 1,000 years. And that 1,000 years had more change in it than the previous 10,000 years. But science tells us this is meaningless. This is not a real, legitimate phenomenon that you're talking about. You're just lining up facts to make it appear as though there is an attractor, to make it appear as though the human historical enterprise is about to run itself into a stone wall or off a cliff or into another dimension. And this is really the question, I think, because psychedelics are, or were once described as consciousness-expanding drugs, phenomenological description, consciousness-expanding drugs. Well, if that's true, or if there's even the slimmest possibility that that's true, then we have to avail ourselves of these things, because consciousness is precisely what we are starving for the lack of. And history is no longer rationally apprehendable by the systems which created it. I mean, everybody who's running around gloating over what happened to Marxist-Leninism should understand that Marxist-Leninism is traceable right back to the social contract theory of Rousseau, and that Western liberalism is traceable to the same root. And the crisis of Marxism is they just died first, that's all. But all these ideologies are on the brink of a coronary thrombosis, and we're going to have to catch the falling bodies when it hits. I mean, do you think that mercantile capitalism, which extracts the environmental reserves at an ever-accelerating rate, has any future whatsoever on this planet? I mean, they're just looting the last few $100 billion worth of stuff before they announce that everybody's going to have to go on a diet that will drop your jaw, you know. So we've come to the end of our rope. So then what do we have to do about it? Well, what we have to do is we have to look back in time and find cultural models that served in the past. And, you know, many of you who have been here before have heard me talk about what I call the archaic revival, an effort to jerk 20th century culture 180 degrees and send it right back to the value systems of the high Paleolithic, because that's the last moment that intelligence, language, religion coexisted with nature on this planet in a less than fatal arrangement. You know, from the moment that agriculture was invented, the die was cast. Because first of all, agriculture is a strategy for dumping a huge database, the database of the hunter-gatherer, and replacing it with a database that is important for only 5 or 6 species of plant. You then give up nomadism, which begins to concentrate your impact on the land into one place. You then plant these crops, and you have such success producing food that now moving anywhere is unthinkable. Plus, the big project after the fall harvest festival is now we have to build a wall to keep the starving people from stealing our surplus. So immediately there's us successful people and those people who weren't successful and who have different cultural values and who didn't produce a food surplus. So, you know, we've decided we're going to sharpen sticks and kill all of them. So then you have warfare, thicker walls, retreat into cities, standing armies, defense of territory, class structure emerge, the notion of wealth as an abstraction, because wealth in a Aboriginal society is a sharpened stone, not your portfolio with your investments neatly listed, you see. So this is, you know, just a pass over these themes. I know a lot of people came hundreds of miles and drove a long way today, and I tend to whip you with this stuff. But the idea is that the psychedelics are more than the best fun there is, which they are, more than a tool for exploring your own psyche and straightening out your own kinks, which they are. They are, in fact, the key to understanding the pathology that culture has become and the way out. I mean, there has to be a way out, and it really is this archaic revival. I mean, and if you're resisting it, think of it this way. If we don't organize the archaic revival, it will be handed to us on a platter in the form of failed agriculture because the ozone hole is screwed up, infrastructures falling apart, financial systems falling apart, the rise of fundamentalist religion. In other words, we are going to have a return to a previous historical model. And it can either be managed humanely through an honoring of the feminine, an honoring of the earth, a return to the techniques of ecstasy that characterized the high Paleolithic shamanism, or it can be handed to us in the form of shortages, famines, disease, internecine warfare, nuclear proliferation, toxic dumping, so forth and so on. But one way or another, this whole edifice put in place by the Renaissance and jacked up to high speed by the European Enlightenment and delivered into this hellish climax by mathematical analysis and the rise of global technology. And remember, each of us has never seen these changes within a lifetime, and yet within the past 200 years the world has gotten tremendously more pathological, tremendously more ill. The size of cities, the power to extract natural resources, to mine Siberia and the mountains of Chile and the interior of the Amazon and Borneo, and these unimaginable technological infrastructures have been put in place to sustain a dying patient. And that's what we have here. We're on respirators. We're getting intravenous feeding. They are monitoring everything because it's not healthy. It can only be sustained through the most extraordinary and heroic means. We're taking bone marrow from the children of the future in order to keep a corpse alive. And people don't find their voice. They don't seem to know how to call a halt. You know, I mean, I listen to the politicos who aspire to leadership, and, you know, they have the same problem with the vision thing as the maximum leader of the present moment. So these are the things that we'll talk about this weekend, and you must steer me, or I will harangue. And it's not a pretty sight, I must tell you. Legal ramifications to this plant collection in Hawaii?
Are some of the plants regulated?
Well, this is sort of a touchy area. There's nothing that is out and out, drag them away, kicking and screaming, illegal, like coca or something like that. It may potentially be some kind of irritant to them. You would have to be a field botanist of great skill and sophistication to find anything that was a problem. There are plants that have never been, that are in some nebulous dimension illegal, but there's never been a test case of it, you see. Because one of the things that would be a rational reformation of the drug laws, and would in fact follow the lead of English common law, is to distinguish between a plant and a drug. In fact, at one point I advocated what I called the Vegetable Drug Act, which would just be simply to state that plants are not drugs. And plants cannot be illegal. You can't make a portion of nature illegal. This is crazy thinking. One of the things that I talk about in my book that we've never talked about much in these weekends because the groups don't seem to have much interest in it, but I found it sort of fascinating, was, for example, in the case of opium, most of us grow up with a completely demonized vision of the morphine family. I mean, this is the lowest of the low, and if somebody gets mixed up in junk, it's just considered, you know, slow suicide and so forth. And it is certainly true that heroin addiction is fairly destructive and doesn't do your relationships any good and that sort of thing. But it was very interesting to me in the process of writing this book to discover that opium which has been known and used by human beings for at least 4,000 years, possibly longer. Nobody ever suggested that opium was addictive until the 17th century, when the English physician John Playfair noted for the first time that exposure to opium created a craving for more opium. It had been used for 3,000 years without anybody ever noticing that it was addicting. And one of the tendencies that this book traces fairly clearly is the tendency to refine and strengthen drugs until they become social problems. We don't seem to rest until we push them to the most virulent, most destructive form. A good example of this that you're all familiar with is coca and cocaine and crack, because coca is, if you go into a coca-using area of the Amazon or the Andes, the villagers, the people you meet, they are very well aware of the cocaine problem in the United States and the DEA and all this. And the first thing they want to tell you is, coca is not a drug, it's a food. And Tim Plowman, God rest his soul, a good friend of many of us, who died a few years ago, a great field botanist, he did studies of the nutritional value of coca and discovered that, in fact, in a coca-using population, up to 30% of the vitamins and minerals in the diet are coming from coca. And it is not a social problem. It does not lead to antisocial behavior or child abandonment or violence or anything like that. It is, in fact, largely, it makes life possible in the jungle because it gives you the energy that you must have. The jungle is an extremely encroaching place. And if the only tool you have to hold back the jungle is a self-sharpened machete, in the absence of coca, you would toss in the towel after a couple of weeks of struggling with this. In the presence of coca, you can settle down to a lifetime. It's a short life. You'll be dead between 35 and 40. But a lifetime of struggling with the jungle. You see, one misconception that it's probably important to clear up that people have about the jungle is when they see the climaxed tropical rainforest, they assume that this tremendous richness of vegetation must signal a tremendous availability of food, fruits and things. This is not at all the case. It's very easy to starve to death in a tropical jungle. And the reason for this, especially an old tropical jungle like the Amazon, the reason for this is because evolutionary competition is so keen among species that there is no luxury to produce rich, juicy fruits loaded with sugars and stuff like that. I mean, often in the Amazon, people will show you what they're eating as a treat, something they found along the trail. And when you bear down on what it is, it's often a fruit or something like that that has just a millimeter thin film of slightly sweet pulp or something like that around it. There isn't it's not a place where it's easy to get a food supply together. So a drug like coca, which suppresses appetite, this is its second important
Alright, there's just a couple of minutes left in this session, so I'm going to cut it here and pick up with the second set.
The suppression of appetite,
Take two coming up.
active compounds in coca,
Take two.
so-called canes, and they mitigate the property of the cocaine. Western science got a hold of this and quickly turned it into cocaine, which is very hard on the major muscles of the heart, highly addictive, and a fairly pernicious drug, although it's the monkey doing it that you usually have to wonder about. And then, in our perverse way, we go to crack cocaine, which is an even more virulent form, more easily delivered. And the evolution of drug delivery systems is an interesting aspect of the whole drug problem. Hypodermic syringes were invented in the 19th century, just in time for the invention of morphine. And following on the heels of those two inventions were two great wars, the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War in Europe, happening at roughly the same time. Out of those two wars emerged the first population of hard drug addicts in Western culture. There had never been anything like that before. At the close of the Civil War, morphine addiction was called the soldier's disease, because there had been so much indiscriminate use of morphine on the battlefields of the Civil War. I am answering your question about agriculture, but stick with me here. So then this is, to my mind, the partnership paradise of prehistory in which the feminine was honored, men and women existed in equilibrium, child caring was shared, men, because of the strong upper body and different physical characteristics, were assigned the hunting, and also because women had babies clinging to them all the time and were not so mobile. So there was an early division of labor. And I think, although I wouldn't argue this to the death, but it seems reasonable to me, that women are probably the inventors of language. And for this, we can both thank them and wonder about the consequences of it. Now, why would women be the inventors of language? It's because hunting is a fairly generalized concept where great emphasis is placed on stoic waiting and physical strength. You need to be able to keep your mouth shut for hours and hours at a time, sitting stock still, waiting, and then when the moment comes, just wail on whatever it is that's running by. The position of the... Well, the gatherer is an entirely different problem, and the women took the gathering. What gathering is all about is fine distinctions. You want to be able to say, when someone says to you, where did you find these wonderful roots? You want to be able to say, they're down near the sulfur spring. They grow in the ground underneath the plant with the small yellow flowers and the serrated leaf edge with the furry underneath. In other words, it's a tremendous problem of location linguistically. And if any of you are botanists, you know that until the invention of photography, botany created a whole special language for itself called taxonomic description, where you would say, well, this plant is cespitous with crenellate leaves, and trichomes are present, and what this is an excruciatingly detailed physical description. And women also were socialized more than men because they shared child care, they spent time together in food preparation, and food preparation is part of it as well. You have to be able to not only tell where the plant came from, you have to create a linguistic machine for conveying how it is to be used. Well, I think that this partnership paradise was really the moment when human beings were most human, most at peace within and without, between men and women, between adults and children, between the human family and the environment, because we were nomadic, our populations were kept small, I think that the sexual style of these early human beings, that we can reconstruct it by looking at phenomenon like the pygmy chimpanzees, and then looking at sexual and social styles among Aboriginal people like in the Amazon. And the chief thing that comes out of that is group values predominate. So consequently, the great tension that drives our society, which is the tension of mate claiming and holding, which we call, maintaining and breaking relationships, really wasn't there. If you, in that hunter-gatherer, quasi-nomadic situation, the natural style would have been orgiastic. And orgy has a very interesting social consequence. It makes it impossible for men to trace lines of male paternity. This is very important. In other words, the children in an orgiastic society are society's children. Women know who their children are because they see them come out of their bodies, and unless they put them down and forget where they put them, they will always be able to go back to their children. Because the sex act and the fact of birth are separated by 9 months, it took a long, long time for the role of the specific male to dawn on these societies. Once male paternity becomes an issue, there's tremendous tension, because the orgiastic style is appealing on one level to everybody, I think. But on another level, if you're concerned about male paternity, you want to suppress orgy, you want to control women, and in fact you begin to think of them as my women and your women, and I have nothing to do with your women and you have nothing to do with my women. So women become a source of great anxiety in this situation. Well, now this is, I want to make it clear, this is not to say that we fell from grace, from a state of grace that was laid onto us by nature, because the style of all monkeys is male dominance. Even if you go back to the primitive primates, the squirrel monkeys and like that, male dominance hierarchies are always what's happening.
I think that does it for the moment.
I think that
it sets the water up a little bit and gets the moon
diet
started.
Actually corrected.
So thanks for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting in the details. Kind of liking some of that loose brushwork bleeding into each other, brush strokes bleeding into each other. I'll do a pan around to some of that. Male dominance
hierarchies was suppressed by this cult of psilocybin use on the plains of Africa. Well then, the very forces which created this situation, which were the drying up of the African continent, which shrank the great rainforests, broke up this partnership paradise, because the mushrooms became, instead of being
some more shadows happening in the clouds,
on these rainy grasslands,
but I think that's a good start for the water.
The rains became less frequent. The distance between water holes became greater. The mushrooms became seasonal. The orgies, which had probably been lunar at first, become more stretched out. Maybe they're equinoctial and solstitial.
You can see the initial brush strokes are retained through the glaze, as well as a little bit of the initial color.
Now, while this is going on, people are aware that the mushroom is getting harder to access. And so, for the first time, they begin thinking of strategies of preservation.
All right, have a good night, Earth.
And in a world without